been wanting to read an in-depth treatment on the Olivet Discourse by a dispensationalist for some time now. I have some difficulties in my own mind in interpreting that particular prophecy, so when I saw Jeff Kinley's new book, The End of the World According to Jesus of Nazareth, and I saw that this book was going to cover the Olivet Discourse, I instantly went online and requested a review copy from Harvest Prophecy. And then to add to my intrigue, earlier this year there was another End of the World book that came out. The End of the World as You Know It by Matthew Halstead. Now, Halstead's book was written to debunk dispensational teaching, and I was kind of hoping that Kinley's book might reference this one. But sadly, I think the similar titles and color scheme are more of a coincidence than anything else. And while I was really excited to pick this book up, I gotta say, it didn't quite meet my expectations. While I was good with Jeff's overall presentation of the end times, his treatment of the Olivet Discourse and a couple of his theological views left me kind of wanting in the end. I think this book would be helpful if someone is looking forward for a straightforward presentation of how dispensationalists view the end of the world. And Kinley writes in a readable style. It's very easy to understand. So all those who want to mock dispensationalism as being overly complex, Kinley shows in this book that it's not. But I would love for you to give me a few moments and I will tell you where this book hits some home runs and where he lined out to the left fielder in The End of the World According to Jesus of Nazareth. Welcome to Rev Reads. If you want to discover more books that will help you to learn more about the end of the world, please subscribe to the channel in order to stay up to date with my most current book reviews. Also, please like and share this video with others to help them know about the work of Jeff Kinley. And I want to say thank you to the Buy Me a Coffee members whose support allows me to cover the cost of keeping up with Rev Reads. I could not continue to do this without your regular support. And if you're someone who's watching this channel, you've gotten some great reviews from it, picked up some really good books, I would love for you to consider supporting the channel at only $3 a month. In this 264-page book, Kinley begins with a look at who is this Jesus of Nazareth who brought us this prophecy. Then he walks the reader through the Olivet Discourse of Matthew 24 and 25, and each chapter of this book covers approximately 2 to 5 verses of the prophetic discourse. And Jeff's goal in this book is to show, first and foremost, what Jesus teaches about the nature of the end of this world, when these things will take place, and finally, how we should prepare. My biggest complaint for the book is that I was hoping for a really deep dive into the text of the Olivet Discourse. But for the most part, in many of the chapters, the verses on the discourse were used as a launching pad to go to other places in the Bible. For instance, on chapter 5, titled Wars Will Be Fought, he spends more time in Revelation 6 than he does on the verses from Matthew chapter 24. And so when I picked this up, I was looking for a book that was going to be a deeper dive into the terminology, the format of the Olivet Discourse, maybe also discuss multiple ways that people throughout history have taken different views regarding those chapters in Matthew. But for the most part, Jeff spent his time talking about how the events in the Olivet Discourse lined up with the passages in Revelation. And if that's what you would be looking for in this book, you would probably find it to be excellent. That just wasn't what I was hoping going into it. And while I think Jeff was correct for the most part in the connections that he made between Matthew 24 and 25 and the book of Revelation, this also made for me the end of the world according to Jesus in large portions more an exposition and explanation of Revelation than Matthew 24 and 25. There were 2 other things that frustrated me in the book. One was that the chapter on the rapture was the last chapter in the book, chapter 20. That chapter should have been like chapter 3, or maybe its own little section at the conclusion of the chapters on Jesus. I say that because Jeff begins describing the events of the rapture at the beginning of chapter 4, which for me, knowing the Olivet Discourse, that's kind of jarring, because I'm like, none of that is in the Olivet Discourse. In fact, the rapture isn't mentioned in the Olivet Discourse at all, which is what he brings up in this book. And while I agree with him on that, he should have had a chapter discussing the rapture and why it's not included in the Olivet Discourse before he had that description in chapter 4, because it just comes out of nowhere. It's like, Jeff, are you just making stuff up here, trying to put things into the Olivet Discourse that aren't even there? I think it would have changed some of my perceptions of the book for the better if that chapter would have been earlier on in the book, to let the reader know, here's why the events of the rapture take place before the Olivet Discourse, and here are the reasons why Jesus doesn't include it in these chapters. Because I think it makes a major impact on each of the chapters that end up following. And the hard thing is that I believe overall, after reading the whole book, Jeff is correct about the rapture and these events, but the order in which the information was presented in the book really threw me off. So honestly, if you're going to read this, I might encourage you to take chapter 20 and read the first 2 chapters, and then, or 3 chapters, and then read chapter 20 as your 4th chapter in the book. I have 2 minor theological points also that I want to bring to light. Jeff presents a Reformed or Calvinistic view of election and salvation and perseverance. This only comes up in a couple of pages of the book and isn't a huge issue on the overall interpretation. I just want to point that out for those of you who are reading this that might not be Calvinist, as I am also not. Second, he writes on Jesus suffering what those who suffer in hell endure following his death. So Jesus endured the sufferings of hell after his death. I think that is an error, and the hard part is that didn't really need to be in the book at all. Now to the good for this book. His overall futuristic approach to the Olivet Discourse and the Great Tribulation and Revelation were very good. He doesn't get caught up in the details of today, trying to prove why this and that in this time period means Jesus is going to come back tomorrow. Did a great job sticking to what we find in the Bible and then describing what those awful years will be like, and why it's not just a description of what occurred in AD 70 at the fall of Jerusalem. My favorite part of this book, though, and I couldn't even pick a single point or comment or quotation on this, because it occurred at several points throughout the book, and that is Jesus teaching the disciples about events that weren't to occur for at least 2,000 years. Didn't leave them behind. Jesus wasn't forgetting about him as he taught that, but Jeff showed why a lesson on the end of days mattered for the disciples 2,000 years ago and why it matters for us today, even though we're still not living in those times. And he combated with excellent skill what I think is the number one most common attack against the pre-trib rapture, which is those who believe in the pre-trib rapture just view it as an escape clause. We don't need to strive today. We can be as lazy as we want to be because one day God's just going to take us all up in the rapture. Jeff shows in this book why the rapture and the tribulation should make us more diligent to share the gospel and to live for Jesus Christ right now. And so while I felt like the book was, for me, somewhat of a mixed bag, there were some things I was expecting to find in it that I didn't get. I think if the order was changed in it, the presentation could have been even better. My hope, though, is that if you go into this book knowing these few things, you will appreciate it even more than I did, because there's a lot of good stuff in here, and I think that every Christian should know what Jesus says about the end of the world.